All right, so welcome to the latest in our series of Cascading Growth events. So this is an initiative that we have been trialing here at Adaptas for the last couple of months. And it really comes from our desire to bring people together. We really believe in the power of conversation as a way of forming connections to then spark insights, spark knowledge sharing, wisdom sharing. And we just thought that it would be nice to start to create a regular space where people knew that they could come, as they were able and as they were available to partake in what we hope will be really insightful and interesting conversations on a variety of topics. And we've really been starting out with a focus on values and trying to integrate this idea of values into a few different topics. And we're hoping to expand and continue to explore a wide variety of topics related to learning and development, personal growth, professional growth as we move forward. So these events were actually sparked by us at Adaptas actually pausing to reevaluate and reshape or revamp, if you will, our own values earlier this year. And so we landed with these three that we're really looking to stand behind and intensify our support within our work over the next as we move forward. And so the courageous insight is related to these events, again, because we felt that often with leadership and personal development, there's a certain amount of courage that is required to keep growing, and that getting insights and learning from other people who've been on the same path can really spark that courage and that belief in ourselves. And so again, that relates to this idea of, right, well, let's bring people together and let's start to share those insights and hopefully spark that sense of courage in a sort of a ripple effect to help more of us step into leadership, step into growth. Collaborative synergy speaks to our belief in commitment and partnership. And really it's about, we believe all positive change happens through really deep connections and equitable learning experiences. And so again, this is an attempt to create those learning experiences and make them more available. And then lastly, of course, we believe in growth and development, but we really love this idea of cascading growth so that we know that when someone learns something or grows in a way that's exciting to them, they usually share it, and they either share it intentionally or they sort of have this ripple effect through changing the way they are in themselves that then maybe impacts the people around them, and maybe that inspires or an insight in someone else or growth in someone else. And so again, these events are an attempt to just contribute to that effect of cascading growth throughout our community and also throughout the world. So that's just a little introduction to the bigger picture of what brings us here today. But of course, today we are here to talk about time management and how that intersects with values. So what I'm going to do is lead us through a sort of a workshop-y approach to just discussing this topic. And then for those of us who are here live, about 15, 20 minutes in, we will sort of dig in and discuss a little bit more deeply around what that means to you if you're interested in doing so. So I do recommend having a pen and paper, even if you're catching up on the recording instead of being here live. Again, this is going to have a very workshop-y feeling, and to be prompting you to do some thinking and jotting some things down. So it'd be helpful to have some tools handy to do that. Okay, so when we think about time, we often, or I suppose time management more specifically, we often kind of feel this either immediate sense of overwhelm or frustration, right? Because a lot of us have a history of feeling quite frustrated or overwhelmed sort of by time, by our relationship with time. And I failed to properly introduce myself and my background. So I, of course, work with Adaptas, but I am also a mental performance consultant in sports psychology and performance psychology. And so I spent a lot of time working with high performance athletes and individuals. And a while ago, I realized that our time management is a very important high performance skill set, if you will. It's often overlooked because we see it as this kind of mundane skill set, but actually it's very closely related to our ability to manage ourselves at a high level and perform at a high level, whilst also maintaining our well-being. So we don't have the time management skills. That's part of often what leads to burnout or overwhelm. So I've become very interested in time management. And I think that it's something we can all benefit from tweaking. And I'm always constantly tweaking and trying to improve my own skills in this area as well. So to start, I'd love to invite everyone to think about or write down what are the things that you value most in your week? So this is just a normal run-of-the-mill week, okay? So not a holiday week or anything like that, average life day to day. So I want you to just sort of run through your normal activities and take a moment to note or jot down the ones that you value the most. And they could be for, it could be anything, it could be for any reason. So I'll just pause for a moment, let everyone to think about that. And I'm going to do this exercise as well as we go through. So hopefully we have that. And of course, feel free to continue to add to that as we go. Okay. So with that in mind, let's step back for a moment and just talk a little bit about values. So we've looked at what we value, okay? But values are a slightly separate concept to that, which essentially is the defining our values as the act of identifying the concepts or principles that are of utmost importance to us in how we live our lives. Now, for those of us here today, or those of you listening, you may have done a values exercise either once or many times already in your life, so you may have a really tangible sense of those values. For other people, you may not have ever done a specific exercise, and so you may have a vague sense of what's most important to you in your life, but you haven't really stopped and crystallized that into a set of terms or words. So what I'm going to do now is just very quickly share an image that will give us just a bunch of examples, if you will, of different types of values. And so this is an opportunity essentially to either, if you have your set of values already, just kind of glance through and maybe be re-inspired by what you see here. And maybe there's something that you'll see that you might think, oh gosh, I might add that to my list. Or if values and a values exercise is a new concept to you entirely, what I encourage you to do is scan through and just notice the ones that jump out at you as something that feels like, yeah, that's really important to me. And take note of those. So you might be adding to an existing list or making note of ones to consider more and to add to your existing list. Or you may be starting your first ever list of values just by noticing which of these jumps out or do I feel a sense of connection with. So as you're doing this, I'll make a few comments on values in general. So we all have values, whether or not we're aware of them. And interestingly, they tend to affect our decision-making and sort of steer us in our lives, whether or not we're aware of them. So becoming more consciously aware of our values doesn't change who we are, but it does give us the opportunity to be more self-aware and to use those values then as a tool more consciously in decision-making or in sort of in the process of shaping our life and responding to the events of our lives. our values don't fundamentally change through life, but they can reorder in order of importance. And so what is most important to us in our 20s might be different from what is most important to us in our 30s, and so on and so forth. Also, really big life events, big changes that we face in our lives can also create sort of a reordering of priority or reordering of values. So because of that, we always recommend at Adaptas to revisit values, an exercise around values every few years, just to check in and see, right? You know, has anything changed? Is there a reordering that may have happened that might be reflected in how I'm living my life? So when we then consider this in alignment with the idea of time management, values, once we're more aware of them, can be used as a tool to shape our decision making around how we're spending our time and how and where we are allocating our time. So I found this to be an incredibly useful tool to bring in the time management process, because it gives us something quite meaningful and deep to anchor ourselves to when we are grappling with this big and sometimes very challenging task or question of time management. I'll just bring this down. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to scan through. Feel free to ask me at the end to bring it up again if that feels useful. So what we see is that the more aligned someone is in how they spend their time with those values, those things that are most important to them, typically the higher our sense of satisfaction and well-being and sort of a life well lived is. When there's a really strong misalignment between values and how we're choosing or how we feel we're forced to spend our time, that can often lead to a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of frustration, a sense that we aren't living our lives the way that we want to or in the way that's the most important to us. And what I always find really interesting is that sometimes we're aware of that satisfaction or sorry, of that dissatisfaction or that sense of misalignment. But if we're not clear on our values or we haven't thought to really consider our values in alignment with time management, we may not realize that it's that misalignment that's really contributing to that sense of dissatisfaction. And so again, bringing the values in to our consideration of time management helps us become more aware of that and therefore act on it and potentially make some changes. So our next little activity then, in light of that, is to do a little bit of a time audit exercise. So today's Thursday, we're almost through our week. And so what I'd like everyone to do now is to consider, where has your time gone so far this week? So you could start on Saturday or Sunday if you want to also consider the weekend, the previous weekend, or you could just start on Monday if that feels simpler. I have this handy dandy pad here that kind of maps out the days of the week, but you can do it, of course, on any kind of pad. And what I'd like you to do is just roughly block out, where did your time go? Okay, from the moment you woke up to the moment you went to bed. And it can be very rough. But just sort of get so that we can look at a few days and get a sense of, where is my time currently going. Okay, so just encourage you to notice what's coming up as you start to do this exercise. It may feel a bit overwhelming trying to like think back through. Some of us may have a Google Calendar or something that we use to kind of vaguely track our time. And so we can maybe consult that as a way of helping to jog our memory as to where our time is going. But if we're not used to tracking or auditing our time, sometimes genuinely the first reaction is to stare at a page and go, oh my gosh, what did I do the last 3 days? It's all a blur. And so a couple interesting things from that, right? So number one, if it's all a blur, and it will be if we don't start to use some kind of process to track our time in some way. And it doesn't have to be like a crazy moment-to-moment tracking, but just even like a general sense, right? It becomes very hard to improve or manage our time management in any kind of intentional way because we're always in it instead of stepping back occasionally to get a bigger picture look at it. So that's one thing to note. And then the other thing you might notice is that as you're jotting that down, you may be thinking, oh my gosh, I spend so much time doing X, or maybe it's already kind of jumping out at you, wow, I haven't had much time this week thus far to do those things that I noted earlier, the things that feel most important to me. And that's a really common realization, right? That when we actually start to look at where our time is going in the week, we see that a lot of it is tied up in things that aren't on that list of most important to us, right? And that's really common. Time that is sort of spent without a lot of intention often just sort of filters off into all sorts of things. And then, of course, we just have the demands of our lives that inevitably take a lot of time as well. So just have a quick think about anything else that you maybe thought of or came to mind or dropped into your head as you started to do that exercise. And we'll, of course, come back to that in a moment. What I'd like to bring our attention to now is very specifically looking at a comparison between your values and the way that your time is kind of being spent or taken up on average. So what I might ask you to do now is to, again, just jot down maybe 3, either of your personal values from your list that you're aware of because you've done an exercise, or 3 that really stood out to you from the list that we shared on the screen a moment ago. And I want you to just look at those values and consider, like, what do those mean to me in terms of time spent? What does it look like to spend time in a way that aligns with those values? So I'll share an example. One of my top values is connection. And of course, that can mean a lot of different things and does mean a lot of different things. But when I think about what that means in terms of time spent, I think, okay, that to me means time spent connecting with people that I care about. So friends, family. It also within my work means taking the time to truly connect with the people that I work with, so colleagues and my clients. And there's a few things that kind of go into that, right? So I'll invite all of you to do the same. Think about what do those 3 values mean for you in terms of time spent? And then once we start to get a sense of that, and apologies, I know I'm rushing this. We could spend a lot of time on these questions, and I do encourage you all to come back to these questions. But in the interest of moving forward here, as you consider that and you think about what those values mean in terms of time spent, I want you to just do almost like a little bit of a gap analysis, right, between where your time has gone this week thus far and those activities that came out when you consider, or those examples rather of how time spent might relate to your values. And just look and see, okay, is there some good alignment there on some of those? So for me, I might look for, okay, did I create opportunities to connect with people this week in my work? And I might go, okay, yeah, you know what, there was some good work connection that happened, but actually I haven't been connecting, I haven't really had any opportunities to connect with friends or family this week, right? That might be one realization that I make. So maybe there's a bit of a gap there. So whatever you're noticing, it's really common, I believe, in my experience anyways, working with people and working on this myself, to see that there is a gap. And I believe that that's partially because we often don't plan our time with our values in mind. So what I'm going to do here before we now finish up sort of the discussion workshop part of this is introduce a technique that I've really enjoyed that's helped me and people I work with begin to intentionally integrate their values into the way that they plan to spend their time, which has a big impact then on how actually our time is spent. So I always like to say that, you know, there's no such thing as perfect time management, in my opinion. So there's no such thing as like planning your week out perfectly to a T and then voila, your week in fact goes exactly that way just because you planned it that way. That's not real life. However, being intentional and planning and looking ahead does really increase our ability to follow that plan for the most part. And there's always going to be exceptions. But we do see that when we plan, especially with that sort of values-driven intention in our planning, we see a big improvement in the alignment between values and time management. And that often has a really positive impact. So it's worth it, and in my opinion, in my experience. So there's sort of one tool with two parts that I'm going to share here. So the general tool is time blocking, okay, which many people have probably heard of. So time blocking is the act of looking ahead and essentially blocking out time for various activities. And so some of you may be familiar in doing this from a work perspective, or maybe even in other areas of life. So that's kind of the basic tool. But the added piece we're going to bring today is an exercise that comes from Muriel's book, Indistractable, which I read a few years ago and have replicated to great usefulness, which is a way of going about time blocking that is values driven. So typically when we're managing our time, however we do that, we often think about work or other kind of demands or requirements first. And then we think about the other people in our lives. What do they need from us? And then maybe if we get around to it, we might think about ourselves and what do we need or what do we want to do in terms of our time. And often that just gets dropped entirely. Or if we get there, we're just kind of trying to shove those things into the crumbs of time that are left over after we've considered the other pieces. So what this exercise prompts us to do, which is really interesting, is actually flip the order of that. And so what it does is goes, okay, when you're looking ahead to a fresh week, first off, we need to be aware of our values and what we value in terms of spending our time and where we want to, what we'd like to prioritize. And then we start with ourselves. So we look at our blank week and we go, okay, what are my values? What are my goals? Where do I want to put in some time for myself to align with those values? So maybe it's like, you know what? Okay, I really want to make sure that I connect with so-and-so this week. So I'm going to put in a little time to have a coffee or a dinner date with her on Thursday, let's say, right? So we start with that, or we say, you know what? Exercise, fitness, being outside, that's feeling very, very important to me right now. So I'm going to think about where might that happen in my week? And we just put that in first. And this often feels very strange because we're not used to putting ourselves first. I've had people say to me, ooh, it feels uncomfortable. It feels selfish to put myself first, to consider myself first in my time planning. And I think that's just a reflection of our sort of sense that we shouldn't be that we should always be prioritizing other people above ourselves, and to put ourselves first somehow means or implies that we feel we're better or more important than the other people in our lives. And so what I always like to say is that what I really believe this exercise does is it's not actually about saying, you know, I'm more important. It's just about bringing yourself up to the same level of importance as the other people in your lives so that it becomes a little bit more equal. So Even if it feels a little bit uncomfortable, I encourage you to just play with it, give it a try, and just see if maybe, as with most things, that sense of discomfort eases as we become more used to it or more familiar with it. So that is the first step in this exercise, to consider ourselves first in alignment with our values. What little bits of time do we need to block off or prioritize or earmark for those things that feel most important to us in our week? And then, just remember, we're reversing the pattern. Then we consider people, the other people in our lives, and we go, okay, what time can I block off or earmark for those things that that relate to other people? So what do other people need me for? Or maybe, it's about, really, we think about the connecting with other people in this category as well. Okay, I haven't seen that person in a while. Can I get something scheduled in with them? So us first, other people. And then lastly, we consider our work or the demands or the must-dos of our week. And we book those in. So when I first started scheduling like this, it did indeed feel strange and uncomfortable. But what I very quickly noticed was that there was still time to accomplish all of my work requirements and still show up for the people in my lives. But approaching it this way meant that I also was able to start to more consistently actually spend time on, not necessarily just on myself, but on those things that really aligned with my values. I was able to start doing that consistently through my week because of that action of considering them first, so giving them space on the calendar before fitting everything else in. And absolutely, this is not a perfect practice. It continues to be something that has to be very intentional, that sometimes doesn't work out the way that I plan it, but overall, it's been very helpful. So that is an example of how we can start to use values a little bit more intentionally in our time management process. Another way would be thinking about using values in how we set our boundaries. So for example, we might start to consider values if something comes to us and we have to sort of say yes to it or no to it. If we bring our values into the mix as we're considering whether or not this is something we say yes or no to, that can really help clarify our priorities. And so we might ask ourselves the question, does this thing actually align with my values? And sometimes recognizing that it doesn't can help us to say no in a kind way, and kind of releases us from that sense of obligation that we may feel to do that thing. So that can be really interesting. So my final recommendation before we move into discussion is to play with this idea of using a consideration of values in our time management planning. And I suppose implied in that is also the recommendation to start the practice of doing a little bit of looking ahead at your week before you are in it. And even if it's just very lightly blocking out a few things to put in our mind the intention of spending time in those areas on those things, I really believe that can make a big difference. So what I like to do to create a bit of structure around this process is to, on a Friday, look ahead to before I do that, on a Friday, I always look backwards at the week I've just had and consider, okay, what worked in my plan and what didn't work in my plan? Did I, for example, plan to go to the gym 3 times and not actually make it to the gym any of those times, right? And now often we avoid that type of reflection because there's a sense of shame or frustration around it. But if I can really bring my learning mindset to that process and really just look at it with the desire to understand and improve, I might go, okay, well, what prevented me from getting to the gym? Why didn't that happen? And that enables us to start to see some patterns. So maybe I go, oh, wow, actually, I wasn't being realistic in the time that I chose to go to the gym. That actually doesn't really work for me. And so then I might say, right, next week, I'm going to try a different time and see if that works better. And so that thought process then allows us to continue to refine and tweak the approach as we move forward. So first we look backwards, and then we look to the week to come, and we say, right, okay, how can I, using that structure, me, other people, then work and commitments, start to kind of structure out that time using the values as a point of reference, and also using my learnings from the previous week as a point of reference. So that brings us to the end of the discussion portion of today. So what I'll do is just quickly share, apologies, just quickly share closing slide for those who are going to be on the recording, and then for anyone who wishes to stay, we can dive into the discussion. So if you're just meeting us at Adaptas here for the first time, you may be interested to know that there are lots of different types of work that we do with individuals, teams, and organizations. We're very focused on supporting people to develop sustainable high performance. And so as I mentioned earlier, we're really interested in high performance, but in a way, doing it in a way that also cultivates well-being so that we can actually sustain it through our lives and we don't burn ourselves out. If you are interested in learning more about Adaptas, you can contact us at the email at the bottom, or you can check out our website using this QR code.